When an avoidant X begins considering reconnection, they don't simply return with apologies and renewed commitment. Instead, they deploy an elaborate series of tests designed to determine whether the conditions that triggered their initial flight have changed enough to make return feel psychologically safe. These tests aren't conscious manipulation or calculated game playing. They emerge from the avoidance nervous system as automatic protective mechanisms assessing whether this person and this relationship can be trusted not to trigger the overwhelming vulnerability that caused them to leave in the first place. Understanding these tests reveals what avoidants are actually evaluating beneath surface interactions, why passing them doesn't guarantee a healthy reconciliation, and how the testing process itself often recreates the exact dynamics that destroyed the relationship originally. The tests expose both the depth of their wounds and their inability to approach reconnection with genuine vulnerability and trust. Test 1. The indifference check. Will you chase or maintain your boundaries? The first and most fundamental test an avoidant X deploys involves gauging your emotional investment and determining whether you've genuinely moved on or whether you're still emotionally available for their return. They initiate low-stakes contact, a casual text about something mundane, a brief interaction in a shared space, or strategic visibility where they know you'll notice. Then carefully monitor your response with laser-focused attention disguised as disinterest. Their nervous system is assessing whether you'll immediately jump at this breadcrumb of contact, demonstrating that you've been waiting for them and are eager to reconnect, or whether you'll respond with measured friendliness that neither pursues desperately nor rejects completely, or whether you'll maintain firm boundaries that communicate you've genuinely moved forward with your life. Each response provides crucial data about whether the dynamic that suffocated them before has shifted or remains intact. What the avoidant desperately needs to see is that you're no longer the person who chased them, needed them, or made them feel responsible for your emotional well-being. They're testing whether you've developed the emotional independence and self-sufficiency that allows them to feel safe approaching without fear of being consumed. If you respond with obvious excitement, immediate availability, or clear indication you've been hoping for their return, their anxiety spikes, and they typically retreat again because nothing fundamental has changed. Conversely, if you respond with genuine indifference that reflects authentic disinterest rather than performed coolness, the avoidant experiences a different kind of alarm, the fear that they've lost you entirely, that the window for reconnection has closed, that you've moved so far forward they can no longer reach you. This triggers their abandonment wounds and often intensifies their pursuit, but from a place of ego protection and fear of loss rather than genuine readiness for intimacy. The response they're actually hoping for exists in a narrow window, friendly engagement that acknowledges them without neediness, interest without desperation, openness without pursuit. They need evidence that you've maintained your emotional center, that your happiness doesn't depend on their presence, and that you're complete with or without them. Only this response signals that the relationship dynamic might have shifted enough for them to risk vulnerability again. During this test, the avoidant monitors not just your immediate response, but your behavior over subsequent days. Do you initiate further contact? Do you ask questions about their life that indicate ongoing investment? Do you mention missing them or wanting to reconnect? Every behavior gets analyzed as data about your emotional state and whether they can safely re-engage without triggering the suffocation that drove them away initially. What makes this test particularly cruel is that it requires you to have genuinely healed and moved on, to not need them anymore, before they feel safe returning. But if you've truly healed and moved on, why would you want to return to someone who left? The test itself reveals the fundamental paradox. They can only come back to someone who no longer needs them back, which means coming back often happens precisely when it no longer serves the other person's well-being. Test 2. The emotional availability assessment. Can you handle distance without demands? The second major test involves the avoidant deliberately maintaining emotional distance while gradually increasing practical or physical contact. They might suggest meeting up but keep conversation superficial. They might spend time together but avoid any discussion of feelings, the past relationship, or where things are heading. They're creating a disconnect between behavioral closeness and emotional availability to assess whether you'll pressure them for emotional intimacy or accept their pacing without resentment. Their nervous system needs to confirm that reconnecting won't immediately recreate the emotional intensity that triggered their flight. They're testing whether you've learned to be satisfied with the level of emotional access they feel comfortable providing, or whether you'll demand vulnerability and expressions of feeling that activate their defensive systems. They cannot handle someone whose emotional needs feel like pressure, so they test whether those needs still exist at threatening levels. The avoidant watches carefully to see whether you interpret their willingness to see you as evidence of deeper feelings they're not expressing, or whether you respect their emotional guardedness without trying to push past it. They need someone who can translate their willingness to show up behaviorally into confidence about their feelings without requiring explicit emotional expression that terrifies them. What they're really assessing is whether you've developed your own internal sense of security that doesn't require constant verbal reassurance or emotional demonstrations. They cannot provide that reassurance without triggering overwhelming vulnerability, so they need someone who can feel secure in the relationship without it. They're essentially testing whether you can love the emotionally limited version of themselves they can safely offer. This test becomes particularly confusing because the avoidant might increase time together, demonstrate care through actions, or even engage in physical intimacy while maintaining absolute emotional walls. This creates mixed signals that leave you uncertain about their intentions and feelings. The avoidant is asking whether you can tolerate this uncertainty without demanding clarity that would require them to be vulnerable before they feel ready. During this testing phase, if you ask direct questions about their feelings, where things are going, or what reconnection means, the avoidant typically retreats. These questions feel like pressure and expectation that trigger their flight response. They need you to be content with ambiguity, to trust that actions speak louder than words, and to not require the emotional transparency that healthy relationships demand. The cruelty of this test lies in its requirement that you accept emotional deprivation as evidence of progress. You're supposed to interpret their willingness to see you while remaining emotionally distant as positive movement rather than recognizing it as the same pattern that hurt you before. They're testing whether you'll settle for less than you need and deserve in exchange for having them back in some limited capacity. Test 3. The Autonomy Preservation Test. Do you have your own life? The third critical test centers on evaluating whether you've maintained or developed a robust, independent life that doesn't revolve around them or need them for completeness. The avoidant observes how you spend your time, whether you maintain friendships and activities separately, and whether you seem whole as an individual, or whether you appear to orient your life around the possibility of reconciliation. They watch to see whether you're available whenever they reach out, or whether you have your own schedule, commitments, and priorities that sometimes conflict with their timing. If you're always immediately available, it signals that you've been waiting for them, that your life has remained on hold, and that reconnecting will recreate the dynamic where they felt responsible for your happiness and fulfillment. This triggers their engulfment fears and typically causes them to withdraw again. The avoidant needs evidence that you have a full, satisfying life independent of them. They need to see that you've built friendships, pursued interests, achieved goals, and created meaning in ways that don't center on romantic relationship. Only when they perceive that you're genuinely thriving alone do they feel safe approaching, because your independence eliminates their fear of being consumed by your needs or becoming your entire world. What makes this test particularly challenging is that it requires you to have genuinely invested in your own life rather than performing independence while secretly hoping for their return. Avoidants have highly attuned sensors for authentic versus performed independence. If you're going through the motions of having your own life while emotionally remaining focused on them, they detect this inauthenticity and it reinforces their decision to stay away. During this test, The avoidant might deliberately contact you at inconvenient times to see whether you'll drop everything to engage with them or whether you'll maintain your boundaries about your own schedule and priorities. They might suggest getting together with little notice to assess whether you have plans that matter more than seeing them. Each of these scenarios provides data about whether you've truly rebuilt an independent life. The response they hope for involves you having genuine commitments that you maintain even when they reach out, demonstrating through actions that your world doesn't revolve around their availability. They need to see that you choose to engage with them when it works for your life, rather than rearranging your life to accommodate them. This paradoxically makes them feel safer and more interested, because it eliminates the pressure of being someone's entire source of happiness. Test 4. The Emotional Reaction Assessment. Have you healed or are you bitter? The fourth significant test involves the avoidant carefully monitoring your emotional state regarding the breakup and their behavior during it. They're assessing whether you've processed and moved past the hurt they caused, or whether you're harboring resentment, bitterness, or unresolved pain that will resurface if they return. They need to know whether reconnecting means walking back into emotional debris they'll be held accountable for. The avoidant watches for signs of anger, passive-aggressive comments, or references to past pain when you interact. They listen for bitter undertones in your voice, or attempts to make them feel guilty about leaving. If they detect any emotional charge around the breakup, whether anger, hurt, or even excessive forgiveness that signals unprocessed feelings, they interpret this as evidence that reconnecting will immediately involve emotional intensity they're not equipped to handle. What they're hoping to find is complete emotional neutrality about the past, evidence that you've healed so thoroughly that what happened no longer carries emotional weight for you. They want to see that you can discuss the breakup calmly if it comes up, that you've taken responsibility for your part without blaming them excessively, and that you harbor no expectations that they'll apologize or make amends for their behavior. This test reveals the avoidant's unwillingness to take genuine accountability for the pain they caused. They're not returning to repair damage, apologize sincerely, or make amends for their hurtful behavior. They're returning only if they can do so without facing consequences or having to sit with your hurt. They need you to have done all the emotional labor of healing from what they did, so they don't have to feel guilty or responsible. The avoidant might make casual references to the breakup to gauge your reaction, mention their behavior during the relationship in neutral terms, or even subtly blame circumstances or both of you equally for what went wrong. They're testing whether you'll accept this narrative without correcting them, or whether you'll hold them accountable for their specific actions. Accountability feels threatening because it would require vulnerability and admission of wrongdoing. During this testing phase, if you express any hurt about how things ended, any anger about their behavior, or any expectation that they acknowledge the pain they caused, the avoidant typically retreats. They interpret these expressions as evidence that you're not emotionally ready for reconnection, by which they mean you still expect them to be emotionally responsible and accountable, which feels overwhelming. The cruel irony is that the emotional neutrality they're testing for often indicates someone has genuinely moved on and healed to the point where they no longer want or need the avoidant back. Someone who is truly past the hurt often has no interest in revisiting what caused it. The test selects for people who are either supremely healed or who have repressed their feelings to appear healed, neither of which creates foundation for healthy reconnection. Test 5. The Vulnerability Tolerance Check. Can you see them struggle without fixing? The fifth test involves the avoidant revealing small struggles, limitations, or imperfections while monitoring whether you respond with judgment, attempts to fix or rescue them, or simple acceptance that doesn't make them a project. They might mention challenges they're facing, admit to areas where they're struggling, or display vulnerability in carefully controlled doses while watching your reaction with intense attention. Their nervous system is testing whether they can be imperfect, struggling, or less than their idealized self without losing your interest, triggering your caretaking instincts, or activating judgment. They need to know whether your acceptance is conditional, on their maintaining strength and capability, or whether you can witness their full humanity, including weakness, without trying to change or improve them. The avoidant fears that showing vulnerability will either cause you to see them as broken and try to fix them, or will make you lose attraction and respect for them. Both outcomes terrify them, so they test in small increments to see how you handle their authentic struggles. They're asking whether they can be human, messy, uncertain, sometimes struggling, and still be wanted and valued by you. What they're hoping for is acceptance that neither dismisses their struggles nor makes them central. They need you to acknowledge what they've shared, offer support if explicitly requested, but not jump into rescue mode or make their problems your mission to solve. They need to remain the authors of their own life and challenges rather than becoming someone else's project. If you respond to their vulnerability by offering unsolicited advice, expressing concern that feels like worry, or suggesting ways they could improve or solve their challenges, the avoidant interprets this as evidence you see them as broken or inadequate. Your help, however well-intentioned, confirms their worst fear, that vulnerability leads to being seen as less than and triggers others' attempts to control or change them. Conversely, if you respond with simple acceptance, acknowledgement without judgment, and trust in their capacity to handle their own challenges, the avoidant experiences relief and safety. This response communicates that their worth isn't conditional on being strong, that struggle doesn't equal unworthiness, and that you can witness their full self without trying to manage or improve them. During this test, the avoidant might share something vulnerable, then immediately deflect, minimize, or change the subject to see whether you'll push for more information or respect their boundaries about how much they want to explore. They need to control not just what they reveal, but also how much discussion or emotional processing happens around what they've shared. Test 6. The commitment ambiguity navigation. Can you handle uncertainty? The sixth test involves the avoidant maintaining deliberate ambiguity about what reconnection means, where things are heading, and what they're willing to commit to while observing whether you can tolerate this uncertainty or whether you pressure them for definition and clarity. They avoid labels, resist discussions about the future, and keep the status of your connection deliberately vague to test your comfort with ambiguity. Their nervous system needs to confirm that re-engaging won't immediately trap them in commitment expectations that trigger their claustrophobia around obligation and loss of autonomy. They're testing whether you've learned to be present in the moment without needing guarantees about tomorrow, or whether you'll demand the certainty and definition that makes them feel trapped and controlled. The avoidant watches for signs of anxiety about not knowing where you stand, attempts to have the talk about what you are to each other, or questions about whether they're seeing other people or where this is going. Any of these behaviors signal that you need more certainty than they feel comfortable providing, which typically causes them to withdraw before things progress further. What they're hoping to find is someone who can invest in rebuilding connection without requiring promises or commitments about where that connection is leading. They need you to be comfortable with ambiguity, to trust the process of organic development, and to not pressure them for declarations or definitions that would require them to know and articulate feelings they're still trying to access themselves. This test becomes particularly challenging because healthy reconnection typically requires some discussion of intentions, boundaries, and mutual expectations. But the avoidant interprets these reasonable conversations as pressure and expectation that threaten their autonomy. They want to rebuild connection on their timeline without being held accountable to any particular trajectory or outcome. During this testing phase, if you ask where things are going, whether they're considering getting back together, or what their intentions are, the avoidant usually responds with vague non-answers or redirects the conversation. They might say they're just seeing how things go, or taking it day by day, or not trying to label things. These responses are designed to keep you engaged without offering the clarity that would constitute commitment. The avoidant needs you to interpret their willingness to reconnect as sufficient evidence of their feelings without requiring verbal confirmation or commitment that would make them feel trapped. You're supposed to trust ambiguous signs rather than needing explicit communication, a dynamic that recreates the very uncertainty and anxiety that characterized your original relationship. Test 7. The Pattern Recognition Evaluation. Will you accept the same dynamic? The seventh and perhaps most revealing test involves the avoidant essentially recreating elements of the dynamic that existed before, testing whether you'll accept the same patterns that didn't work previously, or whether you've developed boundaries and expectations that demand something different. They might display similar unavailability, maintain similar emotional distance, or engage in similar behaviors that hurt you before, while monitoring whether you tolerate it or object. Their nervous system is fundamentally assessing whether they can return to you without having to do the difficult work of genuine change. They're testing whether you've healed and grown in ways that make the old dynamic unacceptable, or whether you're still willing to accept the limited version of relationship they're capable of offering. They're asking whether they need to be different, or whether you'll settle for more of the same. The avoidant might go silent for periods without explanation, cancel plans when emotional intimacy builds, or maintain the hot-cold cycle that characterized your previous relationship. These aren't accidental relapses into old patterns. They're tests to see what you'll tolerate, what boundaries you've established, and whether those boundaries are firm or negotiable. What they're hoping for, paradoxically, is that you've both changed enough to make them feel safe and remained flexible enough to accept their limitations. They want you to have developed the emotional independence that eliminates their engulfment fears, while simultaneously accepting the emotional unavailability that defines their attachment style. This is, of course, a nearly impossible balance. If you tolerate the same patterns that hurt you before, accepting breadcrumbs, accommodating their need for space without reciprocal consideration, allowing emotional distance while maintaining physical connection, the avoidant learns they can return without changing anything fundamental. This might lead to reconnection, but it recreates the exact dynamic that failed before, virtually guaranteeing eventual repeat of the same outcome. If you establish and maintain boundaries that reject the old patterns, the avoidant faces a choice. Do the genuine work of developing their capacity for healthy intimacy, or accept that reconnection isn't possible. Many avoidants choose the latter because the former requires confronting attachment wounds they're not prepared to address. Your boundaries become the mirror, reflecting whether they're truly ready for different outcomes or simply hoping for the same relationship with someone who's willing to suffer through it again. The deeper truth about these tests. Understanding these 7 tests reveals a painful reality. An avoidant ex who is testing rather than genuinely attempting to reconnect hasn't done the internal work necessary for healthy relationship. They're essentially attempting to determine whether external conditions have changed enough to make their internal limitations less problematic. They want to find an environment where their defensive patterns won't cause as much obvious damage rather than addressing the patterns themselves. The tests select for partners who either have exceptionally secure attachment and strong boundaries, or who have learned to suppress their needs and accept emotional limitations in exchange for having the avoidant back. Neither creates foundation for genuinely healthy reconnection. The secure partner will eventually tire of doing all the emotional labor while the avoidant remains defended. The accommodating partner will accumulate resentment while their needs go unmet. Passing these tests doesn't guarantee a better relationship. It simply qualifies you to re-enter a dynamic where you'll likely face the same challenges that ended things before. The avoidant hasn't changed. They've simply found someone willing to tolerate their unchanged state. Real reconciliation would require the avoidant to approach you with genuine vulnerability, accountability, and evidence of therapeutic work addressing their attachment wounds. Tests are what they offer when they want reconnection without transformation. For those recognizing they're being tested by an avoidant ex, the critical question isn't how to pass, but whether you want to. These tests reveal someone unwilling to take genuine risk or do genuine work, someone approaching reconnection from the same defended place that destroyed the relationship initially. Understanding the tests provides clarity, but that clarity should inform your decision to require genuine change rather than impressive test taking as the price of your renewed investment.